Welcome everyone. Sorry, I was having a couple of technical difficulties, but I'm glad that you all could make it. We're just gonna wait a couple of minutes here to let everyone get settled in and join in the workshop. In the meantime, I would love to know what's an interest or hobby that makes you unique, and or if there's maybe something else that comes to mind. What's a cool hobby or interest that one of your friends has? Feel free to share this in the chat, and we'd love to know what you come up with. Let's go ahead and get started, shall we? All right, so once again, I just want to welcome everyone for coming to today's workshop. Whether this is your first one or one of many that you have attended, it's so nice to see all of you all here with me. In case you might not know, I am Aneth, your core coach, and the one that has been texting y'all, sending y'all weekly text messages. Also, I'm a rising junior at Tufts University, which is right outside of Boston, and where I'm studying biomedical engineering. Today, I'm also joined by Sarah, who's going to be our moderator. She is one of Let's Get Ready's transition program managers and is going to be helping everything run smoothly today. So today we're going to be talking about college affordability. So I'm sure this might be something that might already be in a couple of y'all's minds. So to give you a little bit of a sneak peek into what today's workshop is going to look like, what are some of the topics that we're going to cover? We already did our icebreaker. Next, we're going to be talking about the basics of paying for college. So what are some of those key terms that you're probably going to see pop up a lot as you go through this process? We're also going to be going over a couple of strategies such as building an affordable college list and applying for scholarships. So what are some of these strategies that you can use to help keep tuition low? We'll also be talking about FAFSA, which I'm sure some of you might have already heard of. So how can you prepare for filling out financial aid forms? We'll also be talking about how do you bring up finances with family? So what are some ways in which you can open up this conversation, and why is it so important to have this conversation? And finally, we'll be going over how to review financial aid offers. So once you have submitted all applications and you have received decisions and financial aid award letters, how do you decipher what they mean, since they can be pretty confusing? So before we get started, I would like to introduce our raffle of the day. So throughout the workshop, you will have an opportunity to earn points towards today's raffle, where one lucky winner is going to receive a $25 gift certificate. There are several ways for you to earn points, one of them being coming up with mute and participating, and another being keeping your camera on. Of course, there will be points where you will be asked to turn off your camera, but keeping your camera on for the majority of the workshop will allow you to earn another point. So you can earn a maximum of 2 points throughout this workshop. I also want to remind you that for every workshop you attend, you will also receive 1 point towards the grand prize raffle, where the top prize is a $100 gift certificate. And since today is sadly our last workshop, we will be texting the winners of the grand prize after the workshop once we have collected attendance. So now we can go ahead and get started. So first, to start off, I'd like to go over the basics of paying for college. So as I said, what are those different terms you will likely be hearing a lot as you go through this process? And also just what do they mean? So contrary to what you might think, students rarely ever pay the full price of college tuition. And that's because much of that sticker price or cost of attendance is reduced by many different types of financial aid. Some of the most common forms of financial aid are scholarships and grants, which are money you never have to pay back. And then there's also things like work study, which is essentially part-time jobs that allow you to earn money towards things like personal expenses. So it does not have to necessarily be used to pay tuition. And this is also a type of aid that does not have to be paid back. Another form of financial aid that you might be hearing a lot about is loans, of which this type of financial aid is one that you do have to pay back. And generally there are two types of loans. One of them being government loans, which generally have lower interest, so you pay a lot less money back long term. Another being private loans, which tend to have higher interest rates, so you do end up paying more long term. So having heard what a couple of forms of financial aid are, you might start or have already started thinking about how you would like to use some of these for paying for college. So for some of you, this may look like applying to multiple scholarships. Well, some of you might be thinking about, well, what is the minimum amount of student loans that I can use to offset that cost of attendance? Now, I want you all to just take a moment and think about what you would like your own path to look like. So looking at some of the different options that I have on the screen here, Which of the following best describes your goals related to paying for college? Now, I'm going to be launching a poll here in a second, and I want to know what you're thinking. So we definitely have all different types of goals. We're seeing the majority of students may be thinking getting as many scholarships as possible, or graduating with no or minimal debt. Some of you are thinking getting a full ride scholarship or working towards that high return on investment job that we have talked about before. I know that like many of you, I was definitely thinking about, oh, what is the most amount of scholarships that I can apply for? We're thinking about that full ride scholarship for paying off my own education. But for many students, that is not the case. For many students, loans will definitely be a form that they use to pay for college. And for some of you, that's definitely something that you have been thinking about. Now, I want to take a moment to just give you a little bit more context on student loans. Because the truth is that graduating without debt is not possible for many students, and that's okay. What I really want to do is help you be more conscious about the decisions that you'll be making and get a better understanding of what they look like long term. So first, let's start off with some facts. So according to the Pew Research Center, first-gen college students are more likely to take out loans, and first-gen college graduates tend to owe more. So here, if we look at the numbers, we see that 56% of students with college-educated parents incurred some sort of educational debt. So we're seeing that for many students, not possible to graduate without some sort of debt. But if we look at the amount of first-gen college graduates that are also incurring some sort of debt, we see that it's 66% of first-gen college students. Now, we see some similar numbers when we see how much students are owing after they graduate. So 57% of second-generation college graduates owe more than $25,000 in student loans, while 65% of first-gen college graduates owe more than $25,000 in loans. So we're seeing that still first-gen college students there are more first-gen college students that are having to take out loans to pay off their education. So in general, the impact of student loans is disproportionate on first-gen students, low-income students, and students of color, which is why it is so important for you to just have some self-education and also figuring out how to plan out how you want to take how do you want to pay for college, and just have a general understanding of what are some of those avenues and what they mean in the long term. Now, I want you to remember that, if you want to understand this a little bit more, or you want a little more context on student loans, you can always reach out to me and we can discuss some resources that will be helpful for getting a better understanding of what student loans mean and also understanding just how they work out. So when starting out that financial planning process, you will likely be thinking about what can make college more affordable, what can make your education just more affordable to pursue. And you might be asking yourself, well, where do I start? And here I want to introduce like a couple of strategies that you can use to keep college affordable. Can I have a volunteer read these out for me? Our first way to keep college affordable is to create an affordable college list. Number 2 is apply for lots of scholarships, which I'm sure is something that you all have already been thinking about. And also number 3 is to choose the best financial aid offer. So in the next couple of slides, we'll be going over these a little bit more in depth and just getting a better understanding of how you can actually use these strategies. And first, we're going to start off with building an affordable college list. So there's a variety of list building strategies that you can use to help keep costs low. Some of these being looking at schools that have a low sticker price, including community colleges, public in-state universities, low tuition schools, looking for schools that might offer good financial aid, such as those that meet 100% of demonstrated need. You may also be looking into schools that have great merit scholarships, so thinking schools that offer full ride scholarships, and also schools with large endowments, so they are able to provide more opportunities for scholarships. And I definitely want to really emphasize those schools with great merit scholarships for some of the students with impressive academic profiles, as these will definitely be schools that you should be on the lookout for. I also want to note that financial aid does function differently for undocumented students. And so schools with low sticker prices and schools that meet 100% of demonstrated need for undocumented students is a really good starting point. Now, I know that there's a variety of links on the screen, and Sarah has shared out a couple of these, but you will definitely have a chance to explore some of these links on your own in just 1 second. So reflecting on some of those strategies that we just shared, I want to ask you all, as you've been building your college list, what have you done to include affordable options in that college list? Now, for some of you, this isn't really something that you had started to think about especially when you consider things like fit factors and looking at schools that might be match schools. And that's definitely completely okay. It's definitely easy to overlook things like finances when you want to make sure the community is right for you, maybe that they have the major you want, good vibes, things like that. But for some of you, maybe this has been something that you have been constantly thinking about as you're building a list. So I want to ask you, are there any strategies that you have been using as you are building your list to include affordable options? Let me know in the chat if this is something that you have been thinking about, and maybe how have you been applying it to your own list? I'm seeing someone volunteer. You can go ahead and unmute.
Yeah, I was just gonna add that I think so far I do have like a part-time job, so I guess that can include like to my college, like after high school, and as well as the fact that I have been researching a couple of scholarships, but I think what's been um I guess putting me down a little is the fact that like a lot of these scholarships do have like lengthy application processes, so it's taking like a little more time.
Yes, and I'm glad that you brought up that part about these scholarships. There's definitely a variety, not just the ones that we talked about here, but so many other strategies that you can use to help pay for college. And for sure, scholarships is usually the first thing that we think about, but they do have lengthy requirements. Now, in the next couple of slides, we're actually going to talk about what are some ways in which you can approach applying for scholarships, and that makes it a little bit easier to digest and kind of figure out how to maximize your chances of actually winning these scholarships. So thank you so much for bringing that up. I'm also seeing a couple of other comments here in the chat. So yes, your school might likely provide a couple of like resources that you can use to build that affordable college list, such as looking at those full need schools, looking at some of those like big name scholarships that you usually think of, like Questbridge, can definitely help make things a lot more affordable. Yes, I'm definitely seeing that a lot of your counselors are definitely being very, very helpful by providing you those resources on how to build a list that provides pretty good sources of financial aid. Now, I just want to take a second here to just go back to some of those links that we were looking at, and just like thinking back to some of those that we discussed, which ones of these maybe would you like to incorporate into your list, or see if your list covers any of these already? So maybe there have been some strategies that you have been using, and maybe there are some strategies that maybe you had not heard of before or would like to see how you can incorporate them into your list, or maybe you might find out that some of these schools that you added to your list might actually be a lot more affordable than you thought so. So looking at some of these links that Sarah shared in the chat, I want you all to take a moment and just look through some of these types of schools, and maybe just like think about what are some of these that you maybe would be interested in applying to your and adding to your list. I know many of you mentioned having seen a couple of schools that offer like full ride scholarships, or some of these schools, maybe partners that offer partner schools that you have looked into that offer full ride scholarships for students, that apply through a specific set of programs. But are there any types of other schools that maybe you might be interested in? Have you looked into schools that perhaps are low tuition, or any other types of schools that maybe have caught your eye? See, I'm seeing BU, definitely looking at some of these like private schools that probably have larger endowments. Are there any other types of schools that you all have been looking at? Maybe a couple of other private universities, maybe your local in-state college, couple of community colleges. See, I'm seeing state public schools, absolutely. Taking advantage of some of those in-state grants that come in when you apply to public schools is definitely a good way to make school affordable. So here we see that there are a variety of different strategies that you can use while you're building your list, but this is definitely not the only way that you can make education affordable. So, which is why I want to go and talk about a couple of other strategies that you can use. So for many of you, when you think about college affordability, including myself, the first thing that comes to mind is usually scholarships. But what does that process actually look like? So for example, what does that timeline look like? How do you actually search for scholarships? How do you prepare for them? We're going to be talking a little bit more in depth about this in just a couple of seconds. So here we've laid out a scholarship timeline, and this is because similar to the college application process, we want to approach scholarships step by step rather than trying to get it all done in one sitting. And here you'll see that our timeline starts this week. The reason being because in the fall, you will have lots of college application related things to do. And also this is when a lot of those deadlines come up for scholarships. This week, what we really want to focus on is identifying scholarships that you might be interested in. So for example, I know a couple of people already mentioned some they might be interested in, such as we think of like Questbridge or Posse, but what are some other scholarships that you could possibly look into? Maybe there are some local scholarships, some scholarships offered by organizations that are in the area. Thinking about what are some other scholarships that we can start to look into and to gradually build up a list. So throughout the month of August, you really want to focus on prioritizing and prepping based on those scholarship deadlines and requirements. So as you're identifying some of these scholarships that you might be interested in, you want to keep track of those scholarship deadlines or requirements to make sure that you are not missing out on any opportunities, and also that you know what are some of the things that you need to prepare. So for example, does a scholarship require an essay, a transcript, a resume, letters of recommendation? You want to make sure that you have everything in order and organized so that you don't miss out on any opportunities, and you want to make sure that you have everything ready to go for when these deadlines come up. So from September to April, you really want to focus on when submitting those applications. And also you want to stay strategic and prioritize specifically those scholarships that you feel are most connected to maybe some of your characteristics, or those that you feel like you might have greater chances of winning, as at the end of the day, you really want to focus on really prioritizing those scholarships that will have, increase your chances of winning that scholarship and applying it to your education. Now, as I mentioned, it is really important to keep track of all those scholarship deadlines and requirements, which is why Sarah here shared a scholarship application spreadsheet tracker, which I think will be very, very helpful for keeping everything organized so that you don't feel overwhelmed by keeping track of all these scholarships as you go into the fall. So of course, the goal of applying to scholarships is winning scholarships, but what does a winning student usually look like? So College Essay explains it this way. Usually the students who are winning these scholarships tend to have great grades, an amazing talent, or they may have been recognized in some way for an ability, such as through an award or competitions. Or they may have a very specific identity or unique set of characteristics, such as being an adoptive Native American transgender female from Montana, majoring in floriculture with veteran parents who now work as teachers. So many times having a specific set of qualities will actually allow you to be eligible for very specific scholarships, and likely these scholarships have a lower amount of applicants, which increases your chances of winning. Now, another thing to keep in mind is that students who win these scholarships recognize that staying determined is key, even if it is time consuming. Looking at these characteristics that College Essay Guide talks about is kind of like what you might see in a winning student. Which ones of these do you feel might describe you? If you feel like there's more than one that describe you, that's great. If you feel like it's only one, that's totally okay. We can definitely work with that. And if you feel like some of these characteristics might not quite describe you, that's also no problem. You really want to focus, however, on your attention on building an affordable college list. So working with those strategies that we just shared. Yes, and I definitely see So I'm talking about unique identity and background. Absolutely. This is actually something that we're going to go into right now and just, start to think about, as we saw in that specific example about unique set of qualities that make students eligible for scholarships. There are scholarships for all different types of people, and you might be surprised by how varied these opportunities are. For example, you can search for scholarships based on any talents you may have, specific identity you may have, any activities or extracurriculars that you may be involved in, your interests, languages you speak. Truly, the possibilities are endless, which is why you really want to take a moment to reflect on what are some of those characteristics that describe you, as it will help you create like a tailored list that is specific to your own characteristics and also increase your chances of winning these scholarships. So in a moment here, I'm going to give you all a couple of minutes to start to think about what are some of those characteristics that make you, you. I know that for a fact that when I was thinking about this, when I was applying to scholarships, it was not a particularly easy task, but I've definitely had a chance to kind of start to think about maybe what are some of those characteristics that when I was in your shoes, I could have for sure used to apply for scholarships. So for example, if I had been filling out this prompt when I was in your shoes, I probably would have looked at things like, for example, what were some activities or extracurriculars I was involved in at the time? Well, I was in a bilingual choir. So there we have bilingual, maybe it's looking into scholarships that were related to the language I speak, and also choir, scholarships that are related to students who might be involved in choir. Other things such as for me, something that was very important was identity. So being Mexican American, being Hispanic, being first gen, all different things that I could have used to have looked into a variety of different scholarships. And you'll actually find that sometimes it can be really random characteristics that can get you into some pretty interesting scholarships. I have seen scholarships related to like, what is your favorite type of ice cream? And like, I won't lie, I feel like I could have definitely gotten that one. My favorite, I definitely have a very unique ice cream flavor. It's corn ice cream, like the vegetable. But I think it's pretty good, and I think you should all give it a try. But yeah, just want to give you all just like a general idea of what this can look like. Your list does not have to look exactly like mine, but I want to just give you all a couple of minutes to start to think about what are some of those characteristics that you could think about that can not only help you in your scholarship search, but just describe who you are. It's okay if you don't have exactly 5 to 10 things. That could be a little bit less, could be a little bit more. Just kind of want you to start to think about what are some of those characteristics that you can think of that describe you, and just in general get you a good idea of just like what are some different types of scholarships that you could qualify for that you might not have thought was possible before. Alrighty, everyone. So would anyone like to share maybe any of those things that you might have added to your list? Feel free to unmute or you can put it in the chat. I'm seeing art, advocacy. I'm seeing another fellow singer, youth worker. Yes, your origin, your country of origin, your identity is definitely something that big characteristic about yourself that you can look for, that you can use for looking for scholarships. STEM, being first gen. So these are all amazing different characteristics that you can think of that really just make you you, and also can be very helpful as you go through the process of looking for scholarships. Now, some of you might not have thought of a couple of these, so I definitely hope that this inspired you to think about what are some characteristics that you might not have thought of could be used to define you and can be used to help you in the long run in doing things like looking for scholarships. Ooh, I'm seeing a couple of other things. Secretary for a club. Yes, extracurriculars are a huge thing. First gen era. Now, in a second here, Sarah is going to be sharing a link to a resource that I think will be very helpful in starting to think about, well, how can I connect those interests, those characteristics, those things that make me with scholarships, and how will they actually help me in, finding some opportunities that will help fund my education. So here you will come across a scholarship directory, and you see scholarships for all different types of interests. So I know that for some people that might have been things like, I talked about being in choir, so there's definitely many, many, many scholarships that I could have applied to, which is definitely very sad about. Um, when I was in your shoes, we're seeing things like, for example, if you're interested in things like, ooh, so many to choose from. For example, if you're interested in things like advocacy, so many different types of maybe specific forms of advocacy that you might be interested in that can actually be very helpful in, funding your education. Things like, maybe if you're interested in pursuing things like the health field and you might have been involved in some sort of club related to that, you can look at several scholarships that might help you in funding that education so that you can further pursue the health field. I know that for many students, something that they thought about was things like your cultural or racial identity. That's something that's really important. So things like, for example, looking at things like ethnicity and seeing what are some scholarships that you can look at that space more on specific identities. For example, I talked about being Mexican, Hispanic, Latina. There is definitely so many scholarships that are available for this type of identity. And there's even some that are a lot more specific. So for example, I'm Mexican, looking at scholarships that are not only available to Latino students, but specifically Mexican students. So there's so many different types of scholarships that you can look at that you might not have thought you were originally eligible for. Now back to the workshop. I highly recommend you look into this link for sure when you have time and just kind of explore what are some of those scholarships that you might be eligible for that might not have popped up or like you might not have thought about originally. So here we shared one resource that you can use to look into scholarships, but there's definitely a wide variety of them, anything from like, specific scholarships related to your location to an identity, which is why I want to introduce to y'all the LGR scholarship guide. So this link is going to be shared out in a couple of seconds here. So you'll get a chance to look into it a little bit more. But essentially, when you go onto this link, what you'll see is Let's Get Ready Scholarship Resource Guide. So some of you may already be familiar with this, and for a couple of students, this might be your first time seeing it. But essentially what you will find here is general explanation of what scholarships are, a couple of tips on how to approach scholarships, and also do things like avoid scholarship scams, which is definitely something that we want to be on the lookout for. You will also see several ways in which you can start to look for scholarships, whether it be specific scholarship search engines or maybe scholarships that are related to specific things like, as I said, your state or identities. For example, also things like national scholarships. I know a couple of you all were talking about, like things like Questbridge and the Posse Scholarship. I also really want to emphasize a couple of parts on this guide, such as that of the scholarships for dreamers. There are several forms of financial aid that undocumented students may not be eligible for, which is why it's really important to look at things like scholarships to help fund, offset some of that cost of attendance when you're thinking about going to college and how to make that a lot more affordable. So of course, there's tons and tons of things that you can look at in this guide. So I want you all to just take a couple of minutes here to just familiarize yourself with a little bit about this guide and also maybe start to look into what are some scholarships that might have caught your eye or you might want to look into a little bit more. Alrighty, so I'm just gonna give you all like 30 more seconds to, start wrap up your search, but just want to ask, like, as you're looking through this guide, are there any scholarships that might have caught your eye? Maybe a specific like link or list of scholarships that you might want to be looking at later on, more in depth, maybe adding to your own list. You can feel free to share in the chat. Also, if you're not comfortable sharing, that's completely okay. But yeah, if you're comfortable sharing, maybe what is like some sort of scholarship or maybe like a list of scholarships that you might have caught your eye to look at a little bit more in depth later on. Seeing, ooh, the gates just opened. Absolutely. Definitely look into that scholarship. When I was in your shoes, I definitely applied to the gates and I highly recommend because the first round is definitely a lot simpler than many other scholarships. All right, well, I definitely recommend, ooh, there we go. Questbridge. Definitely gonna be definitely something I highly recommend you all look at. definitely have been seeing a lot of getting a lot of emails on QuestBridge, and I highly recommend that you all look at, specifically, maybe if there's a specific partner college that you have been looking at, definitely look into QuestBridge. Ooh, definitely. Resources like Big Future. I highly recommend using Big Future. And actually, that gives us a perfect segue into, a couple of scholarships that I think are really important. And I really, really encourage you all to look at these scholarships. Now, before I move on, I just will say, definitely look at the scholarship guide when you have time. There's a tons and tons of different, resources that you can use on this that can help you build that list. But moving on to one of these scholarships that I think that you should definitely take a moment to look at and for sure apply to, which is the College Board Opportunity Scholarship. Now, some of you may have heard about this already, some of you may have not, but the reason I emphasize this scholarship is because it was created especially for juniors. And it's also nice because they do award a bunch of them. So I highly recommend that you look into it. We're going to be sharing a link where you can look into it more and see kind of what are the requirements, how do you apply for the scholarship. But I highly, highly recommend that you apply to the scholarship, especially because it's a good way to just, get a head start and just start with your first one through your junior year, and that way you can get more comfortable as you go through the summer, go through your senior year applying for scholarships. Now, another scholarship that, this one, I will say, this one has definitely hit me a little bit close to home. I highly recommend that you apply to this scholarship. I remember when I was in your shoes, I was super bummed out when I realized I was not eligible for this scholarship. And the reason being because in order to be eligible for a scholarship, you have to be part of one of the partner programs, one of which being Let's Get Ready. So because you are a student, an LGR student, you are eligible to apply for this scholarship. I highly, highly recommend because it provides so many resources that you can use. For example, there's a $20,000 scholarship, a laptop. Highly recommend. Tech can get really expensive, especially if you're planning on going into a tech heavy field. It can get kind of expensive when you think of kind of those requirements that are preferred. There's also academic and financial support, emotional support, so much more. I highly, highly recommend that you look into the scholarship and do not let this opportunity pass up. So I definitely emphasize a bunch of different scholarships, and we talked about kind of what are some ways in which you can go about researching scholarships, but what does it actually take to apply? How can you prepare yourself to actually, what are those requirements that likely you will be facing when it comes to scholarships, and how do you prepare? So when applying to scholarships, you will likely need a resume. Now, I definitely want to emphasize this resume portion. When I was applying to scholarships, I did not exactly have a good resume, which definitely made it a little bit difficult into how I was going to actually go about, submitting a resume. Making sure I had a solid resume was a little bit difficult because, I definitely did not look into as many resources as I should have. Now, which is why I definitely recommend you look into this link that Sarah is going to be sharing, which is essentially a guide on how you can go about writing this resume. It's definitely not as difficult as you might think. However, I definitely recommend that if you feel like you're having a hard time writing this resume, or if you just want someone else to look at it and give you some feedback, definitely do that. Another thing that you'll likely be needing for applying for scholarships is letters of recommendation. Now, many of you may have already asked a teacher to write a letter of recommendation, which is great. That means that I highly recommend you just keep in touch with them. That way they can likely, tweak those recommendations so that you can use these to apply for scholarships. Also, another thing that you will likely need is a list of best fit scholarships. So when we were talking about those, those characteristics of things that make you you, we really wanted to think about those because we want, as we're going through the scholarship process, we want to prioritize those scholarships that will be most applicable to ourselves so that we can increase those chances of winning. However, there's also other ways that you can kind of look into these best fit scholarships besides not only connecting to them, but also doing things like looking at those schools, looking at those scholarships that have fewer applicants, especially things like local scholarships, or some of those scholarships that have very, specific identity requirements. Those are going to definitely increase your chances of winning a scholarship. And also, many times when we think of scholarship, we think of those like full ride, big name scholarships. Do not overlook those small scholarships. They can really add up. And sometimes, like if you're applying to college, you might only need a couple of extra dollars to like, make it more comfortable and easy to attend college. And by using things like small scholarships, you can really help fund those like, those any like remaining balance that you want to that you may want to like pay off. So I talked about a whole lot of things in, this section, from the timeline, like what does it look like to actually apply to scholarships? What are some of those things that you want to ideally have prepared? How do you prioritize schools? How do you search for schools, search for scholarships? What are some of those scholarships that definitely emphasize you looking at? Now, it's really important to start thinking about, well, how can I start off this process? If there's so many steps, what is like the first step that you can take in order to, get that head start, get started in, in your own scholarship application process. So thinking back on all these steps and all the things that we talked about, what is one step that you can take this week to help you get started? Let me know in the chat, or you can unmute. Let's see, I'm seeing making a list of all the potential scholarships I can apply to and checking them out. Absolutely, making that list, keeping track of those scholarships that you're really interested in. Starting essays and editing my resume brag sheet. Yes, starting your resume, having that brag sheet that you can share with teachers when they write your recommendation can be very helpful, especially because, you can give them a little more info on what that scholarship is about and, increase your chances of getting it. Outlining essays for supplementals. Yes, especially like, when we're thinking about essays for scholarships, a lot of them may actually be similar prompts to the ones that you'll see for supplements for like college, whether it be like specific supplements or even your common app essay. A lot of it sometimes has a little bit of overlap. So, working on your college essay may actually be very helpful for your scholarships. But there, as I said, there might be some overlap. Making a list of scholarships you can apply to. Absolutely. And I definitely recommend adding that list to a spreadsheet. That way you can keep track of everything, like, the materials that you will need and also when the deadline comes up. Oh, one last thing. I definitely want to emphasize like the timeline. So, like we talk about like what is that first step that you can take this week. And it's really important that you think about like, taking this on step by step. And the reason is because this is a really good strategy, not only for now, but later on when you're in college, you might start to think about things like internships or even like grad school scholarships, and figuring out kind of how to like use this strategy to your advantage will make it a lot easier to approach some of those other opportunities, without getting overwhelmed with all of those steps. So definitely a good idea to, use this strategy. All right, so we're gonna take a break now. We've been talking about a whole lot of things, but just gonna give you all like a couple, like about 5 minutes or so to just, go get a sip of water, maybe have a little bit of snack, bathroom break, have a little bit of a breather, and I'll see you back here in 5 minutes. All right, I hope everyone had a wonderful break, and I hope you've been enjoying the workshop so far. Now, on the next couple of in our next couple of topics, we're going to be talking about, how do you bring up finances with family, things like how do you fill out financial aid and also award letters. But to start off with, we're going to be talking about, well, how do I bring up finances with family? What are some ways in which we can open up this conversation? And also, why is it so important that I understand my family finances? So it's definitely no secret that most families don't openly talk about their finances. But when it comes to college, it's actually something you kind of like really need to know. The reason being that how much money your family makes will impact your financial aid offer. Also, your parents or guardians may be able to directly contribute or take out loans to pay off your education, but they also may not. Also, understanding your family finances will allow you to create a school list using net price calculators. Now, some of you may already be familiar with net price calculators based on a link we sent out not too long ago, But in general, net price calculators allow you to estimate aid and remaining tuition at each school before you apply. So it allows you to have a general idea of what it could look like to attend this school and what the cost would be. Now, I definitely understand that this is not an easy conversation to bring up. It's not exactly easy, but it is very important. And I do want to emphasize, though, that you can attend college no matter what. But understanding your family's finances, having an open conversation about this will allow you to create a school list that's affordable for you. So, of course, as I said, talking finances is not necessarily an easy thing to do. Thinking about, bringing up this conversation about your financial situation and also contribution to your education may definitely be a little bit difficult and probably can bring about a lot of mixed feelings. When you think about opening up this conversation with your parents or guardians, what are kind of some of those emotions that might come about? Feel free to like drop in an emoji or just let me know kind of like, something that would describe some of those emotions that can come about when you think about this topic. Let's see, I'm seeing maybe some confusion, maybe a little bit worried, maybe not so sure about it. Maybe for some of you, this might be something that you might be very open with your family about. I know for sure if I got to describe my own feelings when I thought about the situation, it'd probably be something along the lines of, confused, maybe a little bit worried, maybe just like a little unsure about myself on where to start. And that's completely okay. As I said, from personal experience, this is definitely not a particularly easy thing to do. But that's why I want to talk about, what are some ways in which we can open up this conversation? So here I just want to talk about, yeah, as I said, what are some of those ways that you can open up this conversation with your family? So you might remember at the beginning of the workshop, we talked about what were your personal goals for paying off for college. So for some of you that looked like, applying to many scholarships. For others, it looked like using the minimum amount of student loans to pay off their education. So sharing those financial goals with your parent or guardian is a very good way of not only opening up that conversation, but by you sharing these goals with your parents or your family, you will be able to open up this conversation and have a general idea of how you can plan out to hopefully achieve these goals, or maybe tweak it a bit so that it fits more into what your personal finances may look like and how in general you can make this process and paying off your education most affordable. Another way is that letting your family know that understanding family finances will help you create an affordable school list. So having a good understanding of your financial standing will allow you to, as you're building your college list, not only look for schools that maybe fit into some of those fit factors that you're interested in, maybe have like specifically the types of things that you want to look at that will help you achieve your academic goals, but also keeping in mind how you can make these several schools that you might be looking at more affordable. Now, for some of you, maybe it's not how to bring up this conversation, but when. So one way that you can go about doing this is, asking to have a conversation ahead of time, essentially scheduling a time rather than putting someone on the spot, as this will allow you to, sit down, have a more thorough conversation, and have a more thorough understanding of that financial situation. As maybe putting someone on the spot, you might have not necessarily get the full picture of what your finances may be looking like, and by having a sit down conversation, you will be able to better plan out what your list can look like. I know that this is definitely not all the ways that you can approach this conversation. Personally, when I had to approach this conversation with my parents, it was more about, preparing them for the fact that as a first-gen student, I knew that I would be pretty much filling out most of my financial aid forms on my own. So by preparing my parents by being like, I'm going to eventually have to look at your financial aid, things like your tax forms and things like that. It basically really allowed them to start to think about, well, how much can I actually afford to pay for college? And, if my parents really could at all. So that's definitely maybe another way that you can think of that you can bring about bringing this conversation with your family. Now, the reason we, emphasize this is because it's not only important to have an understanding of your family finances, But it's also important to bring up this topic, have this conversation with your family, because in many cases, one or both of your parents or guardians will need to fill out your financial aid forms. Now, if you look at this graphic, it kind of shows you a little bit more about what parent that would be for you that would have to fill out FAFSA. So I'm just going to give you all like a minute or so to look through this document and just have a general understanding of what that might look like for you. Now, I just want to definitely emphasize that some specific situations may not be specifically addressed in this graphic, including if you're a citizen, but your parents are not, as well as if you don't live with either, or if you don't live with either of your parents. So this link in the chat will give you a better understanding of how those situations might work. Now, as you look at some of these graphics and some of this information, you might have a couple of questions come up, and I definitely do want to emphasize beforehand that I am not an expert in this, but I highly recommend you take some time to just look through the FAFSA website, as it does offer tons and tons of useful articles that will allow you to just have a better understanding of how FAFSA might be, for like how you can fill out FAFSA for your specific situation, and also what are some of the steps that you might have to take. But if you do have any questions on how you can have access to these resources and might be a little bit confused on, where I can go to get some advice, for sure, let me know and we can definitely work this out together. Now we're going to be going into what might be what is in my opinion, one of the most important parts to prepare for. So, this is my opinion, but if there is nothing else you take away from today, then let it be this, and that is preparing for filling out FAFSA. Now, why is it so important? Why is FAFSA so important, and what is FAFSA? Now, FAFSA stands for the Free Application for Federal Student Aid, and it provides access to free money in the form of grants and scholarships. So a couple of forms of financial aid that we talked about earlier. It is also used by schools to evaluate need-based financial aid in the form of low-interest loans and work study. Once again, a couple of other forms of financial aid that we described earlier in the workshop. I do want to emphasize this point, which is you will need to complete it every year. So I'm currently a rising junior going into my third year of college, but I have been filling out this form every single year. I also want to add in a note that if you are not a US citizen, you may or may not be eligible. So we're going to be adding in here a link so that you can kind of get a better understanding of what your eligibility may look like. Now, usually the FAFSA application opens up in October. Does anyone know what month it opens up this year? I'm seeing maybe a couple of mixed answers here. October, maybe some of you may have heard of some changes happening to FAFSA. Any other guesses on what it might be looking like for this year? Let's see. Seems like October might be winning. Nope, there we go. Definitely pretty much split half and half. So this year, FAFSA is actually going to be opening up in December. And this is because you will be seeing a revised form of FAFSA, so they had to push back the date. Now, this is not exactly an ideal situation. I know many of us definitely still think of FAFSA as maybe like, October 1st, October 1st, October 1st. Like that is, the magic date. But that is definitely not the case. And I know that this might bring about maybe a couple of feelings of stress. None of us are particularly familiar with this. Your academic counselor, your academic advisor or counselor may also be feeling a little bit of stress with this change. Now, the best way really to prepare for this new format is, and the new opening date is to keep your ears open for any update. And even if the date has changed, you definitely still want to remember that you want to fill it out as soon as it opens. So why do we emphasize this? Why do we usually emphasize, that October 1st deadline? Well, now maybe the December deadline, but why do we emphasize filling out FAFSA so quickly? Well, the reason is because money is assigned on a rolling basis. So the longer you wait, the later you apply, the less money is available. Also, different states have different FAFSA deadlines. So I highly recommend you keep an eye out for what the deadline looks like in your state. And if you are not quite familiar with that information, and definitely look out for any link where you can check that out. Also, FAFSA does require that in order to fill out FAFSA, you will likely have to prepare a couple of materials such as tax forms, IDs, etc. And sometimes figuring out what all of those documents are in your home may be a little bit difficult. So making sure that you are prepared and have everything ready to go, definitely might take a little bit of time. So you want to make sure that you have all that ready to go when FAFSA comes out. Now, the main takeaway I want you to, have from this is that for many things, it is okay to wait for the deadline to do it. This is not one of those places. You want to complete FAFSA as soon as possible, as soon as it opens. So there's definitely a couple of steps that you want to, there's definitely a couple of steps that you want to complete in order to get ready for FAFSA. And these are a couple of them. Can I get a volunteer to read these out for me? Yes, okay. I have one volunteer.
Okay. So steps for getting ready. Number 1, create an FSA ID. Use your personal email so you don't lose access. Keep your login info. It will be the same every year. And C, it may take up to 48 hours to be processed. Number 2, have your parent, guardian create an FSA ID as well. And number 3, assemble this list of financial documents, IDs, etc. Number 4, create a FAFSA account. And number 5, set aside an hour to sit down with your parent or guardian to complete the FAFSA.
Thank you so much for volunteering. And I hope you all paid attention to these steps because it's definitely something that you will need to keep in mind. So I want you to take a moment to just emphasize a couple of things, which is things like, the FSA ID is separate from creating a FAFSA account. So you will need to do this first. You and your parent guardian will need to do this first. Also, setting aside an hour, super important. This hour will likely save you between $5,000 and $12,000. I also want to emphasize that assemble this list of financial documents. As I mentioned before, there are several documents that you want to have ready to go when filling out FAFSA, such as things like your social security number, tax forms, things like if you have a driver's license, any other forms of identification will be really important to keep in mind. All right, so as we've been talking about FAFSA, we can definitely see it is kind of a complicated process and one that requires quite a couple of steps to be prepared in advance. But I want to ask you all, when you think about FAFSA and when you think about filling out financial aid forms, do any of you maybe feel a little bit intimidated or maybe perhaps a little bit overwhelmed by the process? Raise your hand if you agree with any of these feelings. Yep, I'm definitely seeing quite a bit of us, me included. I won't lie. I definitely agree. These are definitely FAFSA is and just in general, filling out financial aid forms is not particularly a fun activity to do. It can be intimidating, overwhelming, even if this is something that I have been doing for a bit, it still kind of trips me up sometimes. The reason being because, this is, as I said before, this is a complicated process to go through because it kind of differs based on your specific financial situation. That's because, everyone's financial situation is going to be different, which makes this process complicated. Also, if you have to take on the lead on filling out these forms, I do want you to know that you are 100% capable of finishing. I was someone who had to definitely fill out pretty much all of FAFSA on my own, as have many of my other friends. And this is not impossible, but if you ever feel like you come across a point where you are a little bit confused or maybe unsure about a part of the application, do not hesitate to reach out for help. Even though the format is different this year, there's definitely going to be a couple of things that kind of stay relatively the same. And some of the information is pretty much repeated year after year. So if you know someone who has filled out FAFSA before, or just in general, any other people that may come to mind that may have some experience with it, and you are feeling a little bit lost, for sure, reach out to them. These people might be, your guidance counselor. As I said, someone you might know who be already familiar with this process. Friends were filling it out too, working with a friend so that you both are kind of providing each other support, and also reaching out to your LGR coach. If you ever feel like you're a little bit confused by this process, for sure, ask for help. Let's see, I'm definitely seeing a couple of questions here in the chat. I highly recommend that if you have any questions specific about FAFSA, definitely reach out to me after the workshop and we can talk about, one, what are some of those resources that you can look at? And I also may be a bit more, like a little bit familiar with some of these processes, as I definitely know I had a little bit of a complicated situation with FAFSA, but we can definitely talk about this a little bit more in depth after the workshop. Now, before we move on to any other portion, to the next portion of the workshop, I just want to kind of like talk about a couple of things that maybe I did not emphasize before, and that's things like, as you're going through the process of filling out FAFSA, you may want to become a little bit familiar with what are some of those questions that you might get asked. So FAFSA offers an outline, like a preview of what that application is going to look like, both in English and Spanish, so that you may share this with, maybe you have Spanish speaking parent or guardian. If Spanish is your first language and you feel more comfortable with that, for sure, these are ways in which you can become more familiar with the application. Also, I highly recommend you check out College Essay Guide's guide to avoid the most common rookie FAFSA mistakes. And this is because, some of those terms you see on FAFSA might be a little bit confusing. So familiarizing yourself with what some of these questions mean, maybe how to answer these questions, what kind of answers maybe FAFSA is looking for. These are some good ways that you can just feel a little bit more prepared when FAFSA opens up and it's your turn to fill this out. Really want to emphasize this one, keep checking your emails. Some people get selected to complete FAFSA verification. I know I had to go through verification and it was a particularly stressful process, and that's because I definitely did not check out my status as much as I should have. So do not make the same mistake that I made. Check your emails. And one last thing, you might have heard that FAFSA is not the only financial aid form that you'll be filling out. For many of you, the CSS profile will also be another financial aid form that you will likely be looking at. Now, the main differences between the CSS profile and FAFSA is that CSS profile is a little bit more in depth, so it does require a lot more information than the FAFSA, and it also unlocks more private aid and scholarships. So you'll likely be having to fill out CSS profile if you're looking into things like private colleges. So definitely recommend, as you're looking at different schools, checking out what kind of financial aid forms they require. So we've talked a lot about the process of applying for scholarships, like what are some of those forms that you'll be using to pay for school, filling out financial aid forms, etc. But what about, once you have submitted everything, once you have submitted all of your applications, what does it actually look like to review some of those financial aid award letters, and what does it mean? What are some things, you want to keep in mind as you're looking at these letters? Now, can I have someone read out this slide for me? Remember, you all, this is definitely an opportunity for you to earn some points for the raffle for today. All right, I see I have a volunteer. You can feel free to just unmute and go ahead and read the slide.
After you finish all of your financial aid and college applications, you'll wait to see where you are accepted. Each college that accepts you will send you a financial aid award letter. These are super important. The amount of aid each school gives you will vary, often dramatically. Financial aid letters are confusing and come in different formats.
Thank you so much, Serenity, for reading this slide for me. So I definitely want to just emphasize a couple of things, especially those last two bullet points. The financial aid award letters that you will be receiving will have, very, very different formats, and they will also be very confusing. I know that as I've been working with a lot of my seniors who are getting ready to go into their first year of college and just preparing for, paying off that first bill, trying to figure out what that cost for that first semester based on those financial aid award letters has been definitely something that has been a little bit complicated. So preparing yourself now so that once you reach that part of actually reading your financial aid award letters and understanding what that cost will actually look like will be so helpful, so that as once you are getting ready to actually go into college. So just want to emphasize a couple of things to know as you start to think about financial aid award letters. Once again, these formats are likely going to be very different and they will be confusing, so much so that some schools will actually use these different formats to try to make it appear like you'll pay less. I will also emphasize things like, for example, using things like these resources will be very helpful. We'll be sharing a couple of resources to kind of help you understand how to review these letters. Sometimes when you open an award letter, it kind of can be a little bit confusing on like what each section means, and just trying to, mentally calculate what it actually ends up looking like you will be paying. So we're going to be sharing some resources that will help you get a better understanding of how to review these award letters so that you're prepared for next year. I also want to emphasize that during this time when you're in the process of getting your financial aid award letters and comparing letters, it's really a good idea to utilize the support of your coach. If you feel like there's something that's just not making sense, something is not adding up, maybe you have two award letters that seem to be saying the same thing, but maybe they're might not, I highly recommend you reach out to your coach if you feel like you're having any doubts or a little bit confused. Can I have someone read out this last point that I really want you all to just have a pretty good understanding of? Can I get one volunteer to read this line? Alrighty, I guess I can read it, but I will say you're definitely missing out on a couple of points. So one thing, one last thing I really want you all to really just commit to your, I guess, thoughts would be you don't want to commit to a college before you review the financial aid offers from all the schools you get into. You really want to make sure that you are comparing all the financial aid offers that you are getting so that you are able to pick the offer that works best for you and just the best offer overall. You don't want to, maybe have an award letter that might make you think that you're getting a really, really good package. And then maybe it was just the wording was a little bit confusing, or maybe you receive an award letter from another school and you start to realize that, hey, actually this one was a little bit better. And maybe I would have actually maybe wanted to attend the school a little bit more. So that's also something to keep in mind. You want to make sure that you are comparing, your financial aid offers and considering things like, is the school somewhere that I really want to attend? And also sometimes is the cost worth attending the school? So you really want to take a moment to just review these financial aid offers. So I definitely understand that, the topic of this workshop is something that is often on many of our minds, because finances is not exactly a easy thing to understand or just have a very clear conversation about, or really just have a good understanding of how it looks like in college, which is why, Let's Get Ready is here to support you. Whenever you feel a little bit confused, whenever you just want to clear up some doubts, if you ever have a moment where you just want to make sure that you have a good understanding or just want to talk about maybe some things related to what it will actually look like to pay for college or just be able to afford it to go to college, definitely reach out to your coach, reach out to me if you ever have any questions. So I definitely want to thank you all for joining me today. We talked about, today we went over a whole lot of things, from talking about, what are those forms of financial aid that you're probably going to come across and what do they mean? What are some strategies that you can use to help keep tuition low, such as how can you build an affordable college list? And also, what does applying to scholarships actually look like? And how can you increase those chances of winning, and how you can build a list that's tailored to your characteristics. We've also talked about how you can bring about those conversations about finances with family. What are some ways to open up these conversations, and why is it so important? We talked about preparing for FAFSA. What are some things that you need to keep in mind? How do you prepare for the new deadline coming up? What are some materials that you need to have on hand? And also, once that is all done, how do you understand financial aid offers and picking? How do you figure out how you can pick the best offer for you? So many things we talked about today. And I hope it was all helpful for you. I do want to say just thank you so much for attending. This is definitely my last workshop, definitely a little bit of a bittersweet moment, but I'm really glad that I got to see you all here. Before we end the workshop, I do want to mention that we do have a feedback form that we will be sharing in the link. At the end of the day, this workshop series is meant to help you and we want to know how we can create a more improve the way that we share this information, and also what are some ways in which we can help you understand some of these topics a lot better. Once again, thank you for joining me on this workshop. Also, just want to say I've really been enjoying participating in this, being your coach. I'm so excited to see you all here, and I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day. I do have, if you have any questions, I'm gonna give you all maybe 3 more minutes. If you have any questions, feel free to unmute or just share them in the chat. If you don't have any questions, you are free to go, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your evening.